Okay, let's go ahead and get at it. This is your in-service day, so I thought we'd go ahead and finish out the chapter on the presidency. So we'll pick up where we left off. So again, you can watch this video at any time. You can watch it tomorrow, which will be Friday, or any time over the weekend. Just make sure you've seen it before we start on Monday. Okay, so at last we met, essentially what we were doing is we were kind of introducing the presidency and talking about some of the responsibilities and the powers of the president. And we started off talking just a little bit about the administrative head of the nation, the role the president has as the administrative head of the nation. So, again, if you remember, the framers of the Constitution really thought that their chief responsibility for the president would be to enforce the laws, right? Execute the laws. But there's a lot that comes with that, right? You think about executing the laws and the executive branch of government. So essentially, the president is an administrator, right? The president has these chief responsibilities, right, to run the administrative branch of the government. Okay, now, having said that, he does it through, and someday maybe she, all right, does it through 4 sources of authority, right? The first one of which being the chief powers that you would associate with Article 2, right? And of course, these are known as the express powers, all right? And when you look at Article 2, it's pretty obvious, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. And as we go down the outline, commander-in-chief, etc., convene and adjourn Congress, and it's that simple. However, there are some other authority, sources of authority that the president has, including implied or inherent powers. Now, every president since George Washington all the way through the current president, President Trump, have asserted some form of implied or inherent powers. What I want you to know first and foremost is that implied or inherent powers are not specified in Article 2 of the Constitution. They would not be considered, therefore, express powers, right? They're inherent. And these are powers that over time the president has essentially taken, right? Now, a lot of it makes sense. Sometimes it's been challenged, right? Whereby Congress has had to challenge the authority of the president, or the courts have had to challenge the power of the president. But for the most part, as a general rule of thumb, and especially as we go through the rest of this outline, when the president has taken an implied power, an inherent power, and has not been challenged, or has been challenged and won, that president, for the most part, has kept that power, right? So the idea is that history plays a pretty significant role over time in that once this power has been obtained, right, inherent or implied, and we're going to talk about a few as we go through this, the president doesn't have to give up this authority. It hasn't. All right, now the power through executive order, right? If we were going to have a semester-long course on constitutional law, we'd spend a lot more time with this. But executive orders have the force of law, all right? And the last several presidents have used the executive order authority significantly. President Clinton did. The second President Bush, President Obama, and of course now President Trump has used it for all sorts of things. Now, the level of law, if you will, associated with an executive order is just below a statute, right? So just below an act of Congress. It still has the force of law, but if Congress wanted to trump, pardon the pun, wanted to trump an executive order, Congress can always pass a statute, all right? Now, executive orders, for the most part, are everyday sources of law. They're directives associated with administrative agencies, basically telling them what they should do. And when we get into the next chapter on the bureaucracy, we're actually going to spend a lot more time on that, all right? But what I want you to know right now is that the president can issue an executive order. It has the force of law. It directs an agency to do a particular thing, all right? Could be concerning the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, Internal Revenue Service. It could be numerous administrative agencies that are involved. Could be a cabinet department, Veterans Affairs, State, Treasury, etc. But nonetheless, does have the effective law. Okay, now executive privilege is a little bit different. So of these 4 sources of authority we're looking at from for the president, this is the one that probably would be kind of the one that didn't belong, but it's a kind of a source of reverse power. The president does have the ability to protect some of his own activity through executive privilege. Now, again, if we had a semester-long course on constitutional law, we'd spend a lot more time talking about this, all right? But as a baseline rule, there are some things that we would consider work product of the president, right? That the president does not have to reveal. This stuff is privileged, right? Now, for the most part, we can contain in this box we call executive privilege things that we would consider working papers, working documents, right? Internal notes between and among administrative agencies, or any type of correspondence between the president and an administrative agency. Now, the president at any time certainly could make these work orders, documents, what have you, working papers available at his, and again, hopefully someday her election, but for the most part, it's privileged. Now, every now and again, these materials have been challenged either by Congress or perhaps the states, things of that nature. But again, for the most part, it's pretty rare to challenge those things. Okay, so let's move on and go ahead and look at the second power. And again, this would be an express power because it's identified in Article 2 of the Constitution, and that is the Commander-in-Chief. Now, one of the things we had mentioned when we were looking at the Constitution chapter is that the framers of our Constitution did not want military control over the military. They wanted civilian control over the military, right? Now, that makes, again, Article 2 is specific about this. The United States President is the top military officer in the United States. It's really that simple. That doesn't mean the president has to have been in the military, had military service, etc. It just kind of worked out well that George Washington did, all right? But we've had many presidents that have never been in the military. They've been civilians their entire life, but once they become president, he, or again, hopefully someday she, will be the top military officer in the country. Now, for the most part, this really means the ability to direct the armed forces. It does not, however, specify the ability to build up the military. Now, that's actually a source reserved for Congress, right? But we're going to talk about that as an implied power of the president here in a little bit. Remember, of course, and we're going to talk about it here in a minute, all right, the power to declare war sits with Congress. Now, and again, when I said remember, we talked about this as one of the express powers reserved by Congress. Now, during the Vietnam War, there was kind of a gray area in the 1960s with our military activities in Vietnam as to whether the president had kind of on a de facto basis declared war. There was no war declaration. But again, we had extensive military activities in Vietnam. Now, you might say, well, maybe this is one of those inherent or implied powers, right? The ability to declare war. Well, no, I mean, that's specified in Article 1, and that's a power given to Congress. Now, what Congress tried to do, right, to curtail the president's quote-unquote use of an inherent or implied power to declare war was to initiate the War Powers Act, all right? And the War Powers Act basically says that the United States president can dispatch troops in a particular military situation for 60 days and then has to go contact Congress and let Congress know what he, and again, hopefully someday she, is doing there, all right, to get consent to continue that military operation past 60 days. And that was seen as kind of a check that Congress put into place. But frankly, it hasn't really worked. It hasn't been effective. The United States president has dispatched troops in many occasions past 60 days and has not asked for continuing, sometimes has asked for continuing support from Congress, but there have been times when the president hasn't. Okay, so you might argue this has really become an inherent or implied power to kind of declare an unofficial war, if you will. Okay, number 3, and still looking at express powers, all right, the ability to convene and adjourn Congress. Now, this is actually one of the very few sources of authority for the president, again, expressed in Article 2 of the Constitution, whereby the president has kind of given this back to Congress, all right? It's really the Speaker of the House that really decides when Congress is going to be in session. So the Speaker of the House, who again is elected by the House almost indefinitely, going to be somebody that serves as really the administrator of the House of Representatives, but nonetheless is a member of a political party, and Congress is convened and adjourned based on the party in control's needs, if you will. But again, very rarely does Congress go out of session. It's pretty predictable too. But the president does have the authority to adjourn and convene and adjourn Congress, almost always just for emergencies. It's incredibly rare. Okay. Next, again, another express power. The president has the ability to veto legislation. Certainly has the ability to sign legislation, but also has the ability to veto it. All right. And again, when we're looking at the chapter on Congress and looking at the legislative process, the president certainly has the right of pocket veto and pocket signature. Right. So where the president doesn't do anything, and you just kind of have to wait around to see whether Congress stays in session for 10 days. Now, with that said, now you see a note on your outline concerning the light item veto, and I think this is important to spend some time with. If I were teaching this class 20 years ago, it was a very, very hot topic. It is not a hot topic so much right now. Who knows? Maybe it'll be reinvigorated at some point in time. But first question becomes, what really is a line item veto? Well, line item veto would allow a president to look at a piece of legislation and then just strike out certain provisions. Okay. Now, Congress did give the presidency this authority, and it was found to be unconstitutional. Now, the funny part of this, of course, is that governors actually have this kind of authority. So a governor, say the Ohio governor, has the ability to look at a piece of legislation and merely just scratch out a piece if he or she doesn't approve of it, but also keeping the rest of the piece of legislation intact, and of course, once signed, becomes law. This is not possible at the federal level. Again, 20 years ago, a very, very hot topic. And the reason it was a hot topic, it was maybe seen as a way to kind of get rid of some of the fluff in a piece of legislation, something that would allow the United States president maybe to, especially in a budget bill, trim some of the budget and say, okay, well, let's keep the rest of it intact. It made the piece of legislation, made it through a very, very long, arduous process, whereas you already know from the Congress chapter, very rarely does legislation make it all the way through. But nonetheless, keeping it intact and saying, we've done a lot of hard work. Let's try to keep what we can. But again, that's not the source of authority held by the president currently. Now, what would it take, however, for the president to get a line item veto? It would actually be one of two things. Number one, you'd have to have a reversal of Supreme Court precedent, which is very, very rare. And we've got a whole chapter on the judiciary, and then we're actually going to look at civil rights and civil liberties and talk more about the courts and their activity later. But that's rare. All right, overturning existing precedent is very, very rare. The second, of course, is a constitutional amendment. So perhaps maybe the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution would be providing the president with a line item veto. Again, it's not something that's absurd and just so grossly unheard of, because again, governors actually have that right. Okay, the appointment power. Now, again, it just so happens we're talking at a time where Judge Kavanaugh is going through proceedings and hearings, possibly to become the next United States Supreme Court Associate Justice. And today was kind of a crazy day. I'm recording this on Thursday, September 27th. So we've all been kind of watching the hearings and seeing what's going on. But the president, the United States president, appoints lots of people, not just federal judges in the lower bench, or again, what we're talking about, or what we're looking at today in terms of the United States Supreme Court. But all sorts of other persons. And I'm just going to give you a couple of broad stroke categories where the president has this appointment power. Certainly, number one, all federal judges. Okay, this includes Article 3 judges as well as Article 1 judges. We'll talk about the difference when we get into the courts chapter. Okay, now, all subject, of course, to Senate confirmation, right? You need a majority vote in the Senate. Also ambassadors, right? All ambassadors to all countries where the United States chooses to send an ambassador, of course, must be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The same is true for for cabinet officials and other agency heads. All right, so the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, the United States Attorney General, Secretary for Homeland Security, but also the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, etc. They all have to be appointed by the United States President. Now, these are people that are generally part and parcel of the United States government before they got to this particular position. These are generally insiders. They may have held a position in the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate, or they're a lifelong bureaucrat. They have that experience. Sometimes the president will tap somebody from the state level. That's a little rare in case. But almost always from the president's own political party. Some exceptions, and actually some noteworthy exceptions over the last couple of decades. But again, cabinet officials, ambassadors, federal judges. There are some other officials. Those are the three big categories that I would want you to know. But all subject to a majority vote in the United States Senate. Okay. Also, an express power for the United States President is the treaty-making authority. Now, we've already talked about this in a couple of different situations. You already know that this is one of the situations where there is a supermajority required. The president certainly has to sign, first of all, negotiates, and then later signs the treaty. But again, it has to be ratified by a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate. So, number one, you need a supermajority. But two, if you recall, this is where the House of Representatives plays absolutely no role whatsoever. They're just kind of kicked out. The framers kind of thought, well, maybe that'll just take a little too long. Okay, and then lastly, the ability to grant pardons. Now, it's kind of been interesting lately, given the news that there's been some talk that President Trump might pardon some of those that helped him helped him not only in his career but also get elected to office for all sorts of reasons, whether it's Paul Manafort or perhaps Michael Cohen. Then, of course, there was some talk as to whether President Trump could actually pardon himself. We haven't gone down that road in terms of our Constitution yet. But what I do want you to know is that Article 2 does grant the United States President the ability to grant pardons, but only for federal crimes. Okay, so if I gave you a question on the exam, could President Trump or the United States President pardon somebody for both a federal crime and a state crime? And the answer is no, only the federal criminal Act. Now, state governors, of course, do have the power to pardon, but again, only for state crimes. Okay. Now, again, we'll talk a little bit more about how this works when we get into the courts section. But again, only for federal crimes within Article 2 of the Constitution. Okay. Now, if we had a semester, we're going to move to talking about expansion of presidential power. If this were a semester-long course on the presidency, this would really take maybe about a fourth of the class to go through, and it would be more of a history lesson in showing where the United States president really has taken on more authority. Now, it's not one of these situations whereby we could say, well, the president became power hungry. There are many situations whereby in our system there just had to be some type of unitary leadership, and somebody had to do something, right? And when you have a large Congress at today's level, 535 members, how do you get all those people to agree, and how do you get those people to collectively actually do something? Again, there have been situations where we've needed unified leadership, and you get a couple examples here in your outline. One is Washington's declaration of neutrality in separating the United States from what was going on between France and Great Britain at the time. Now, what that did is a brilliant political move for sure, all right, where President Washington was saying, look, you guys are getting into this war, and we're going to stay out of this, right? What it did, of course, is it protected a very fragile new country at that time. Of course, we had just finished fighting the British, and the French were saying, hey, we kind of helped you along. Well, why not give us a little bit of help here? And Washington, astutely said, I got to stay out of that and protect my very fragile country. And, of course, we wound up in war with the British in 1812. So just a couple decades later. So President Washington really knowing the political landscape pretty well. Okay, certainly President Lincoln during the Civil War, something that was very, very untested, whether states could actually secede, whether parts of states could actually secede. And President Lincoln, who was not, as a United States president, not given the authority really to build up the military, that's a responsibility for Congress, did it anyway. And not only built up a military, but also spent a lot of money and taxed quite a bit to actually support that military. Again, the taxpayer power, that's reserved for Congress. That's an Article 1, Section 8 source of authority for Congress. Again, perhaps maybe going against the Constitution to save the Union, I guess, would probably be one way to look at it. But again, there was a time when we had to have unified leadership, where having Congress kind of act together, it simply just wasn't going to work, right? It just wasn't going to work. So again, probably a classic example. Now, the United States Supreme Court and Congress both backed President Lincoln. No surprise. Again, the United States Supreme Court was actually part of the Union, part of the North, as was the great majority of Congress, but so no real surprise there. But nonetheless, they did back him. He didn't have many detractors. But one of the things that should be mentioned here, right along with the war power, is that President Lincoln did order a blockade of southern ports. Now, military law would dictate that that's actually an act of war declaration, but nonetheless, Congress and the Supreme Court really supporting him. Okay, now, I think, if you're an historian, those first two examples are probably the ones you would hold on to. They're kind of near and dear, and they're kind of exciting. I would actually point to the third one on your outline, and that's the work that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt did during the Great Depression and certainly into World War II. Imagine, of course, after the stock market crash of 1929, President Hoover then not being able to act fast enough. President Roosevelt runs against candidate, I should say. Franklin Roosevelt ran against then President Hoover, won in a huge landslide. Then, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt becoming president. Now, President Roosevelt knew he had a shamble of an economy and had to act pretty quickly. So he took over a lot of authority in regard to the economy, and there was a lot of power that was otherwise should have been delegated to Congress, and then some things that just had never been tested at the federal level, right? Taking almost complete control of the economy and writing industrial codes that, it was kind of a head scratcher as to whether the federal government, let alone Congress, had that power. And certainly the president really shouldn't have had that kind of authority, right? And if you remember, we spent a little bit of time talking about this a couple of chapters ago, especially when we were looking at federalism. Now, with that said, right, President Roosevelt certainly had some detractors. There were a lot of people in Congress, a lot of people at the state level, and certainly some Supreme Court justices that didn't think the president could do these things, didn't even think Congress could do some of these things, right? But President Roosevelt, being a very astute politician, and of course acting in a period really, of crisis, was able to convince Congress to write legislation, and then eventually kind of muscled his way through the United States Supreme Court and got the Supreme Court to find the statutes and his administrative law that accompanied it. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about that when we get to the courts section, finding it to be constitutional, especially starting in 1937. And we had mentioned the Jones and Laughlin Steel case back in the federalism chapter that kind of showed that. Okay, but again, President Roosevelt had almost complete control over the economy at that time. And again, since then, right, the New Deal, right, has been endorsed by the Supreme Court. There have been, if this were a semester-long course on constitutional law, we could look at some cases where, things might have gone the other way, but they're incredibly rare. If the president has wanted to act in terms of promoting and protecting the economy, he's been able to, as has Congress, really, for that matter. Now, when it comes to the Cold War, clearly this was maybe one of your best examples across several presidents, different from Washington's Declaration of Neutrality, again, just one president, President Lincoln, during the Civil War. But again, here, the Cold War across many presidents where unified authority was really needed, all right? And essentially what these presidents did were really three things, right? And again, certainly starting with President Truman all the way through the first President Bush. Number one was a buildup of the military, right? Now again, for the most part, it's supposed to be the responsibility of Congress, but the president building up the military. Number two, creating military alliances. Now again, it's true, the president is the chief military officer, but when it comes to building alliances, this was something to a certain degree that's kind of new. I mean, that was something that always took place in Europe, but now the United States doing it. And three was building up a lot of academic programs that would support the Cold War effort, if you will. A lot of money invested in science, a lot of money invested in technology, a lot of course, going into the military-industrial complex, but even things like food science and food technology really designed to say, hey, you know what? We're ready for war. And if it happens, we've got the technology to try to get our people through it. But really, from President Truman all the way through the first President Bush, I mean, that's what they were consumed with, was making sure that we were protected from communism. Now, again, you can debate back and forth whether that was worthwhile or not. But nonetheless, that was really the reason, or the reality rather. Okay, so, and then lastly, just the sheer growth of administrative agencies. Now, as any administrator would tell you, if you've got more people working for you, you're going to naturally become more powerful, okay? Now, there is no doubt that administrative agencies have not only grown in number within the executive branch of government, but also grown in terms of breadth, in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of responsibility. Now, when we get into the next chapter on the bureaucracy, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the delegation doctrine, rather, whereby Congress has actually given that authority to the United States President. But nonetheless, it's grown and grown and grown. It's grown not only in sheer number, but certainly workforce, the budget. Think of all the people that the President now has to appoint and all the lesser officials that those political appointees actually hire, but also grown in terms of breadth of responsibility. It's grown and grown and grown to the point where, you kind of scratch your head. You think, well, the framers certainly wanted Congress to be the strongest branch of government, but that really hasn't happened. I mean, again, if we had a semester-long course on the presidency, what we would have seen, more so than anything, is really the growth of the executive branch, to the point where, if you had to rank them, you would certainly argue that the executive branch of government is by far the most powerful. And then you kind of go back and forth in a debate as to whether Congress or the courts are the kind of hold rank number two. And I would make actually the argument that the courts are number two, if you will. Okay, so again, if we had more time on that, we would certainly do it. Okay, so let's talk about the president's power to persuade. Now, the president, of course, is a party leader, not officially, but certainly unofficially. So if you think about President Trump today, he is seen as the leader of the Republican Party, as was President Obama seen as the leader of the Democratic Party. The second President Bush, again, leader of the Republican Party at that time. It just makes sense. Now, officially, no. I mean, they actually have office holders for those things. There's a Republican national chair and a Democratic national chair. But again, in reality, functionally, it's the United States president. Now, with that said, all right, the president is constantly trying to persuade Congress, state governors, state legislators, even ambassadors, all right, other countries, if you will, to come on board with his and, again, hopefully someday, her policies. We'll see, all right? Now, let's look at some ways in which the president has power to persuade. Okay, now we start with the honeymoon period. Now, when I started teaching this stuff way over 20 years ago, the honeymoon period was real, all right? And we generally define it as the first 100 days of a new president's first term. And everybody's warm and fuzzy, right? Even in periods of divided government. So let's say we had a newly elected Democrat and the Republicans control the House and the Senate. Everybody got along. There was a lot of ability to persuade Congress. Everybody had just been elected. It was the honeymoon, right? Everybody kind of got along until the marriage got a little bit older and you started to see some of the problems pop up. Again, almost always partisan based. Now, however, right? Again, that was the reality when I started teaching this stuff. That is, for the most part, gone away, right? Really starting with President Clinton's first term, there really hasn't been a honeymoon period. That's been kind of gone. And we'll talk about why that's happened even more so here in a little bit. But we've had really fractured government. We've had a real divided country since President Clinton's first term. A lot of people point to the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. I would go 8 years before that. I think it's really President Clinton. We've been a divided country for, it's called now, say, 26 years. And again, I think the numbers bear that out. Okay, now, the honeymoon period, again, certainly up through 1993, again, President Clinton being elected in 1992. The honeymoon period was real. A lot of ability to persuade others. Now, second, however, and probably more so important today, are approval ratings. As you might imagine, the higher the approval rating for an incumbent president, the more power they have to persuade, right? So if you have, say, let's just call it almost an unheard of number, 70% approval among the public, the public's going to kind of carry the day, and other members of Congress, right, know they need to jump on board, because if the president is saying certain things, endorsing certain policies, and people are behind him, and again, hopefully someday maybe her, they know they better get on board too. And you start to see, if the incumbent president is a Republican, the Republicans, of course, feel a lot better about it. But you even start to see some Democrats kind of turn and say, well, maybe we should start supporting some of these policies that the very popular president supports. Now, frankly, again, I use that number 70%. That's exceedingly rare. I mean, that's incredibly rare. We haven't seen those kind of popularity numbers really since President George W. Bush, the second President Bush's approval ratings during the immediate aftermath of 9/11, where his approval ratings were just sky high, right around 90%. But that was rare, and we'll talk about that as an event of crisis here in a second. Okay, so approval ratings. Higher the president's approval rating, the more authority they are going to have to persuade people. Again, members of Congress, even the courts perhaps, state governors, state legislators, ambassadors, other countries, etc. Okay, so what affects support? Well, certainly economic conditions. If the economy is good, the president's going to have pretty high approval ratings, right? If the economy is doing well, the president can take credit for that, right? So if you think about today's economy, all right? The economy today is humming right along. We have low unemployment, right around 3.9%. GDP growth of just under, or just right around 4% rather. Economy's humming right along. Now, President Trump hasn't been able to take complete advantage of some of this, but when it comes to managing affairs, managing the economy, he actually, if you just look at that one issue, he has some pretty strong approval ratings, okay? And those are things he can take credit for. Now, when the economy is bad, we've had several presidents that have had to experience this. Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s, the first President Bush, President H.W. Bush, and the very